This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Placi. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Everyone thinks they can write, but not everyone can tell a story. Yet, everyone does tell stories of one sort or another. It's a situation any games writer can often find themselves in, and one where you often find yourself having to justify your existence, which is a burden no one should have to carry. But here we are. Writers and narrative designers also have the additional requirement of fitting the narrative to the game, rather than fitting the game to the narrative. I think the key divide between interactive media and the narrative media is the difficulty in opening up an empathic pathway between the gamer and the character as differentiated from the audience and the characters in a movie or a television show. Steven Spielberg. There's a struggle that's unique to narrative designers and writers when it comes to game development. Getting across information that hasn't been systematized. UI designers, artists, gameplay designers, and really, anyone who's working on the systems of the game always has to be concerned with what they're building conveys and how. But when that information isn't included, then it's the job of the writer or writers to get that across to the player. Writing is about conveying information to the audience, and not just the words themselves, but their meanings, impacts, implications, even relations, and that's before you get to the characters, plot, setting, or themes. Your words have a lot resting on them. The problem is in getting all of that and more across to the player, not to mention reminding them should they have just started the game after a break of who knows how long. And when you've got a game with heavy characterization or role-playing, especially one that allows the players to make decisions in that regards, then the writing has to do a lot of extra work. Enter Mass Effect. As a game, there's a lot of dialogue, not to mention text to be presented to the player. The vast majority of it is accompanied by voice acting, which was quite nice, but only when a particular line of dialogue is activated. Anything in the codex is, of course, automatically read when played. But the dialogue is what's key, because what was said by the characters in the dialogue and voice acting was not always what was presented to the player as the choice available. Mass Effect's dialogue wheel always presented a problem for the writers because of the limited space available to display all the options. They had to convey reams of dialogue, the PC would say, in only 20 to 30 characters. And there were plenty of times when what was said, what was shown, was not ultimately what was said. For example, "Don't try to study me" became, "I'm not some artifact you can take back to your lab, Doctor." Well, that's not even necessarily how it was presented, but you get the idea. That isn't the only occurrence, and it's something that's never totally been eliminated, due in part to the fact that the tone, implications, and other aspects of what's said aren't necessarily conveyed by that short description provided. For role-playing games, especially ones presenting choice and allowing players to play their own way. Sounds like a Burger King ad. It's vital that any choice indicates all facets of it. Players don't want to be misled, but to have things play as they expect. This is especially true when setting the tone and developing the character they're playing. Other role-playing games certainly have more text or dialogue than Mass Effect. The Pillars of Eternity games are great examples, but they don't use the dialogue wheel and instead list everything that can and will be said. Granted, that's always the first line and not any follow-ups. Alright, it's time to get abstract because we're going to talk data and compression. Words, written or spoken, are, after all, a means of compressing data. The best way to explain this is with the meme, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. Both the words pipe and a picture of a pipe are in fact not pipes. They are representations of them. They are abstract compressions of what a real pipe is. Neither the word nor the image has all of the facets of a real pipe. Some, such as the weight, smell, mass, size, taste, texture, and even context, have been lost in the compression from real object to abstraction. That's not to say that when we read the word pipe or see the image of one, we don't fill in some of those facets. But that's a personal context, which is not transferred to the abstracted object, or necessarily the real object. It remains within us. The beauty of these abstractions is that we can connect disparate ones to build a more multifaceted representation of the original. We can string words together to better describe something. We can paint finer details to add to our abstraction. It's why a novel is oftentimes the closest thing we have to telepathy. Legos are also a perfect example. They can make a truly impressive representation of physical objects, from cars to airplanes to lightsabers. But they themselves are not those objects. Yet, every brick we lay, we're defining it anew, though others won't know of each brick inside a creation unless they take it apart. And taking things apart, examining them, and putting them back together is an aspect of the novel and writing in general that doesn't so readily lend itself to the visual arts, unless, of course, it's a static object. But where we don't find static objects is in those that are affected by time. We play time as if it were an accordion. We compress it and stretch it out. Of course, we, in this case, is writers. But it's how we can have both One Day of Life in Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Ulysses by James Joyce. Each is about a single day in a man's life, but the first is 176 pages, while the other is 730 pages. Games generally don't have that ability to compress time, given their real-time interactive nature. We have lots of ways to move through time in a game that go beyond the mechanical and draw from cinema and TV for their narrative effects. But it's games like Frozen Synapses and Dungeons & Dragons with their turn-based approach that provides the closest analogy to what we can do in a novel. A fight may take place over a scant few seconds, but playing out those seconds takes minutes, if not hours. Combat is a unique aspect of games given how readily it's used to resolve situations, not just because it's done quickly, or can be, but because it's so binary. A player is either in combat or isn't. An opponent is either dead or they aren't. There's little room for a gradient or spectrum beyond the amount of ammo one has or health remaining. Stories, relationships between people and characters don't work in such a black and white manner. Yes, there can be those binaries, but by and large, the most interesting ones give us gradients. Han Solo is another great example. In a universe that presents as black and white, yet is anything but, remember, there are outlaws, rebels, slavers, drug dealers, assassins, crime bosses, and more. Sure, Luke may be all good and Vader all evil, but Han straddles that middle. He shoots first, but saves the day. Stories also let characters move about that spectrum through an infinite number of actions. Simplifying those into a select few repeatable verbs is a struggle when it comes to creating a game. Writing allows for nuance. What's possible in terms of that nuance takes more in a visual medium that isn't using real humans. Take the case from The Last of Us Part 2. At an earlier point in history and with lesser technology, all of the emotions, actions flitting across the characters' faces wouldn't be possible. Even with performance capture, the story, the nuance, the details are being filtered multiple times by the actors, editors, and technology. So, what's been written is never what appears to the player. Nuance, though, really shows through in the verbs available to players. The reason most games stick to predefined dialogue is because of all of the possibilities dialogue itself presents, which gets outside the scope of what's meant to be possible in a particular game, or doesn't simply serve the story being told. As Austin Walker wrote regarding Red Dead Redemption 2, because RDR2 wants me to know that Arthur's first instinct isn't violence, hitting L2 doesn't aim down his gun's sight, introducing more friction, since that's what so many other games in the genre do. And instead, it locks on to someone, or something in the world, allowing me to speak or interact with them. In doing so, that mechanic actually responds to a complaint about non-RPG open worlds for years. Stop making games where all I do is hurt things. But currently, it seems it takes a large production to offer a significant range of actions for a player to do, let alone dialogue options. And that's before you get to a game that has systemic interactions, like Prey or Dishonored. Writing a game is frustrating in comparison to writing for other mediums. Not only are you affected by the game's budget, but its production time and set of verbs. Those three aspects will inevitably dictate more of the story than even the genre of the game or the characters. And I've spoken about this before on the episode Break the Loop, to the effect that a character, a story, is always going to be limited by the choice of verbs available. So, what can be said? What can be done with verbs that result in violence? It's just going to be more violence. A number of the Citizen Able games by Blendo Games, in particular 30 Flights of Loving and Gravity Bone, actually reverse this paradigm, with the only verbs available to the player being non-violent ones. All of the violence is saved for NPCs and in-game cinematics. Walking sims tend to avoid violence altogether. Of course, Paratopic does have a moment of it, but it is used to great effect. Tacoma and Firewatch, two games I oddly haven't spoken about in a while, and that's sad, imply a certain amount of violence, but never show it or make it actionable on the player's part. Compounding these issues is marketing. Part of selling a game, making it successful, is sharing the story. And what shares well isn't always the story you want to write or tell. It's something that all game developers have to take into account. But so do those working in other mediums. If you're creating for the market, it's not merely writing what's currently popular and trying to chase a trend, only to fail. It's understanding what works, what doesn't, and what's been overused. From a sales standpoint, you can be looking at something as simple as the genre. In books, fantasy outsells science fiction. The main argument there is fantasy is easier to understand, since everyone knows how to swing a sword. But the technology in science fiction needs to be explained. The obvious counterpoint to that is the Disney properties, Marvel and Star Wars. Both incorporate a level of science fiction with fantasy and mesh them well. Selling those stories is just a matter of highlighting the good versus evil nature of them. It takes more than that, but for writers that may be all you need to know. Simple stories, whether they're told in a complex manner or not, are an easy pitch. If you're an indie developer, then these are the things you need to think about and take part in, especially as the writer. If you're not an indie, then the chances are that the company you work for expects you to be a part of the marketing efforts regardless. And you don't necessarily want to repeat the failures of Halo 5 and its Hunt the Truth campaign. The latter was really interesting for the story it was telling, and quite successful, mind you. But it set the game up as being something it ultimately wasn't. Had marketing and the writing and development team been more involved together, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. Yet, playing Halo 5, you do get the sense that the levels, and as a result, the story elements are missing, having presumably been cut before the game went gold. Okay, throughout this entire discussion, I've been talking about the struggle writers have with others on the team or with the technology. And of course, I haven't even touched on personal issues, whatever. But ultimately, get over yourself. There's work to be done. Sit down and write. But there's one aspect we haven't addressed. The players. Players will do what you least expect and always have motivations of their own. Writing for that. Keeping them informed. That's a perpetual struggle. Narrative and game designers can probably affect this more than other writers, but it is ultimately our job to provide justification for what we're doing. The reasons of the player character should, as closely as possible, align with those of the player. Yes, it's not always possible, especially in open world games. It's a conceivable argument for why Red Dead Redemption 2 is so strict during story missions, limiting the options to keep players aligned with Arthur. Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit points out in his review of Red Dead Redemption 2 that Breath of the Wild blurred the line between the main and side quests and built an entire chemistry system to play with. Red Dead Redemption 2 did nothing like that. Of course, as writers, we're going to have to work with the tools and resources the rest of the team provides. We can't necessarily go in expecting or demanding certain considerations be made for the sake of our stories. We're not TV showrunners. But the constraints we're provided make writing stories for games all the more interesting. For now, thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Placi. Everything I do can be found at onegamedad.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at onegamedad.com if you want to talk writing, games, this show, or even working together. I also have a new project that's ongoing. It's called, it uses the hashtag #StartTheDayWrite, and every day I take a new piece of artwork that I find, generally on ArtStation, and I write a story or a scene based on it. And I share it with the world. You can find that on Twitter at #StartTheDayWrite, or you can find that, of course, on onegamedad.com. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.